In 480 BCE, Xerxes crossed into Greece with what ancient writers described as the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. He burned Athens to the ground. He won at Thermopylae, and then at Salamis. His fleet was shattered in a narrow strait his own admirals had warned him against entering. A year later, his army was crushed at Plataea. By any normal measure, this should have been the end of Persian ambitions in the Aegean, and in the propaganda of Greek historians, it was framed as exactly that, the salvation of Western civilization. But 6 decades later, Persian gold, not Persian swords, decided who would win the Peloponnesian War, the very conflict that tore the Greek world apart. This is the second secret of Persian resilience. An empire that had learned to win wars it appeared to be losing, using time, wealth, and patience as weapons sharper than any blade. The empire that absorbed Marathon like a passing storm now faced a far greater trial. Not one battle, but a war of attrition against an alliance of Greek city-states, and a slow internal erosion that would test whether Persia's genius for administration could survive its own success. When Xerxes' fleet was destroyed at Salamis in September 480 BCE, the Athenian playwright Aeschylus, who had likely fought in the battle himself, later dramatized it in his play The Persians as a catastrophe so total that it shattered the known world's confidence in Persian invincibility. The narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Attic mainland had neutralized the Persian fleet's numerical superiority, cramming their larger, less maneuverable ships into a space where Greek triremes could ram at will. Herodotus tells us Xerxes watched the battle from a hillside throne, expecting to witness a triumph and instead witnessing the destruction of his navy's operational capacity in the Aegean. And yet, Xerxes himself did not consider the war lost. He withdrew personally to Persia, but left behind a substantial land army under his general Mardonius, who spent the winter attempting, unsuccessfully, to negotiate a separate peace with Athens that would have detached the most stubborn of the Greek city-states from the alliance opposing him. This detail matters enormously. Even after a naval disaster, Persian strategy pivoted immediately toward diplomacy and division rather than panic or retreat. The following summer, Mardonius was killed and his army destroyed at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE, generally considered by historians the true end of the existential threat Persia posed to mainland Greece. On the same day, according to tradition, a Greek fleet destroyed the remaining Persian naval and land presence at Mycale on the Anatolian coast. By the numbers alone, 480 and 479 BCE should read as a strategic catastrophe. Yet here is the pattern that recurs throughout Achaemenid history. Even total military defeat in a peripheral theater changed almost nothing about the empire's core structure. Persia did not lose Anatolia. It did not lose its fleet-building capacity in Phoenicia or Egypt. It did not lose its tribute base, its road network, or its administrative hierarchy. What it lost was a war of choice on its western frontier, expensive, embarrassing, but non-existential. The Greek mainland was never actually necessary to Achaemenid power. Compare this to what a defeat of similar scale would have meant for Athens or Sparta. Total annihilation of political existence. This asymmetry, where Persia's worst-case outcome was retreat to an already enormous empire, and Greece's worst-case outcome was extinction, explains why Persian strategic culture could afford patience that no Greek city-state could match. That patience became the empire's next great weapon. Rather than attempting a third invasion, Persia turned to what modern strategists would call offshore balancing. Persian agents and gold flowed into Greek politics for the next century, funding whichever faction best served Persian interests at any given moment. Meaning, principally, whichever faction kept the Greek world too divided to threaten Persia again. The most consequential expression of this strategy came during the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BCE. The catastrophic multi-decade civil war between the Athenian and Spartan-led alliance systems that ultimately devastated Greek civilization far more thoroughly than Xerxes ever had. In the war's final years, The Persian satrap Cyrus the Younger provided the financial subsidies that allowed Sparta to build the fleet that finally defeated Athens at Aegospotami in 405 BCE. Persia did not need to march an army into Greece to determine its fate. It simply funded the side that would keep Greece weak, divided, and dependent, a strategy so effective that historians still debate whether Persia won the Greco-Persian conflict roughly 75 years after Salamis, simply by outlasting its opponents and letting them destroy each other. This is the third pillar of Persian durability, an empire wealthy enough that gold could function as a strategic weapon on the same level as an army. The scale of Achaemenid treasury reserves, later famously plundered by Alexander's forces from Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana, gives some sense of the sums available. Ancient sources describe such vast quantities of gold and silver bullion that Alexander reportedly needed thousands of pack animals simply to transport it. An empire that could subsidize entire foreign wars from its treasury without meaningfully denting its own fiscal base was, in a very real sense, playing a different game than any of its rivals. Yet internally, the empire was not static or immune to decay. The 5th and 4th centuries BCE saw repeated succession crises, court intrigues, and provincial rebellions that modern historians sometimes describe under the umbrella term the crisis of the Achaemenid state, though the extent and severity of this decline remains debated among specialists. Egypt, always the most restive satrapy, successfully broke away from Persian control for roughly 60 years beginning around 404 BCE, maintaining independent native dynasties until Artaxerxes III reconquered it in 343 BCE. This episode is instructive precisely because it shows the limits of the empire's resilience. Egypt's distinct civilizational identity, geographic separation by the Sinai Desert, and deep religious traditions made it the one region capable of sustained, successful secession, proof that Persian tolerance of local custom, while normally a stabilizing force, could also incubate genuine independence movements when local identity was strong enough. The mid-4th century also saw the so-called Great Satraps Revolt, a coordinated rebellion by several Western satraps against Artaxerxes II and later Artaxerxes III, though modern scholarship increasingly questions how great or coordinated this revolt actually was, suspecting that ancient and even some modern accounts may have overstated its unity for narrative convenience. What is clear is that the throne faced recurring challenges to central authority throughout this period, testing whether Darius I's original system of separated civil and military authority could still function 3 or 4 generations after his death, as satraps in the empire's more distant corners increasingly ruled as quasi-independent dynasts, sometimes minting their own coinage and maintaining private armies far larger than their official mandate allowed. And yet, remarkably, the empire held. Even amid succession murders, the reign of Artaxerxes III alone is associated with a purge of royal family members so severe that ancient sources describe it as nearly emptying the Achaemenid bloodline of rival claimants. The machinery of taxation, tribute, and provincial administration continued largely uninterrupted. This speaks to the depth of institutional embedding Darius had achieved a century and a half earlier. The empire's bureaucratic class, scribal traditions, many administrative records were kept in Aramaic, the empire's lingua franca, alongside Old Persian and Elamite, and provincial elite structures had become self-sustaining enough that court chaos at the very top did not automatically translate into administrative collapse in the provinces. By the time Artaxerxes III died in 338 BCE, likely poisoned, according to several ancient sources, though the precise circumstances remain historically uncertain, the empire had survived roughly 2 centuries of continuous existence, weathered at least 3 major internal succession crises, 2 prolonged Egyptian rebellions, a full-scale Greek invasion that ended in humiliating naval and land defeat, and a proxy war strategy so successful it arguably outlasted its enemies' entire civilizational unity. No contemporary power on Earth could claim a comparable record of institutional survival. But institutions, however resilient, are not infinite. The empire that emerged under Darius III in 336 BCE inherited a state whose core administrative logic remained intact but whose military culture had, in some respects, calcified. Persian armies still relied heavily on the multinational levy system that had proven so effective in the 6th and 5th centuries, but the tactical innovations of Greek warfare, particularly the combined arms approach pioneered in Macedon, blending heavy infantry phalanxes with shock cavalry in coordinated maneuver, represented a genuinely new category of military threat, different in kind from the hoplite armies Persia had successfully outlasted at Marathon and Plataea a century and a half earlier. It is this new kind of threat, arriving from an unexpected direction and wielded by an unusually gifted young king, that would finally test whether the empire's extraordinary depth of resources, administrative continuity, and strategic patience could withstand a military machine explicitly designed, in some respects, as a study of Persia's own past weaknesses. The empire had outlasted Greek invasion, outlasted its own succession crises, and outlasted its rivals' unity. But its final and most dangerous test was still to come, from a young Macedonian king who had studied Persia's every weakness.